know about Agile is it's almost completely opposite of predictive. So if you feel like you have a good understanding of the formality of the predictive side of things, going through the processes, doing formal change requests, having a change control board, all of that good stuff, then just think of Agile as the complete opposite. Change is welcome. We involve the customer. We don't do a whole lot of planning up front, and you'll start to see that as we go through it. If you can get the terminology down and just the differences between the roles and the different types of meetings, then you will have a pretty good handle on Agile. You'll just have to know the difference between Agile and predictive. That will get you through the exam. So what is Agile? It's a mix of iterative and incremental, and we'll go through what each of these is, but it emphasizes flexibility. So we're not tied to a plan that we, plan for 8 months. Customer collaboration is a huge piece of it. We want to hear back from customers. We want to hear their feedback. We want them to tell us what we did right and tell us what we did wrong so that we can go in the right direction. And then frequent value delivery. That just means that what we're delivering to the customer has, a use. There's some value added to their life or to their experience. And we want to do that as often as possible on Agile. That's what frequent value delivery means. Iterative is just the refining and improving of a product through short periods of work or short periods of time. So you can have a product like this Yeti. You can deliver maybe a very simple version of it at first, and then it just gets better over time. You have more color options. You have a nice fancy handle. You have chrome trimming. You have a nice logo on both sides. So eventually, even though it starts off as maybe a basic one like this, don't ask me why I have two of these with me. It might start off as a basic product like this and then end up like, something fancy like this, bigger, ergonomic, fits in your cup holder, et cetera, et cetera. That's iterative. And it happens through repeated cycles. So I like to call this kind of the masterpiece approach. You're starting from something simple, but you're trying to really create this masterpiece of a product that you envisioned when you first started the project. Welcome, Mayuri. Thank you for joining. We're just covering Agile and Scrum. So incremental is when you have this big kind of elephant of a project or a product, and you want to deliver it in small pieces to the customer. So think of this like an app on your phone, right? Maybe like a DoorDash app. When DoorDash first was released, maybe you could only browse food options and order them for pickup. Maybe there was no delivery option just yet. So that was an increment of it. And then we added the ability to save your favorite food items. So that's another increment of value or an increment of functionality that was added to the app. And then you added the delivery piece. And then you added maybe the customer loyalty piece where you gain points for each order. So it's delivering the product in increments. And eventually you'll get to a full-blown app with all the bells and whistles and features that were thought of at the beginning of a project. That's incremental. And I like to call that the building blocks approach. So you still have the same scope, you're just kind of breaking it down into different chunks of work. Whereas iterative, this might change depending on where we start and where we want to end up. Agile is kind of a mix of both. So it delivers pieces of value or functionality to the customer very often, and it refines those increments over time until we get to a full product that the customer agrees with. So it's heavily reliant on customer feedback, customer insights. We invite the customer into the project so that they tell us, again, what they like, what works, what doesn't work, etc. And that keeps us on track in agile projects. So I like to call this a growing garden. It's not going to stay the same. It's going to change. You may have some new flowers pop up. You may have some weeds pop up that you got to take care of. You might have too much rain one day, so you got to manage for that. Agile is just growing. It really depends on what the needs and desires are. Any questions about iterative, incremental, and agile before we move on?
No, ma'am.
All right, let's keep going. So 4 principles that you want to know for the exam When Agile was first created, a bunch of different people came together and said, look, this planning for 8 months and then executing for 12 and then delivering a product 2 years later, it's just not working for software deliverables, things like apps and, technology. And so they created this full manifesto saying how, customer rules, changes welcome. We want that feedback. We're not going to hold ourselves up for 8 months. We're going to work in short cycles. And so they came up with this really long manifesto. But there are 4 principles on that manifesto that you really want to know for the exam, because these kind of define the Agile framework from a high level. And you do want to know, which ones are compared to which ones. So, for example, individuals and interactions, that's favored over processes and tools in Agile. So you want to make sure you always match up those 2 on the exam. And you may very well have a matching question for all 4 of these. So you do want to know these for the exam. Create a flashcard that will help memorize these. Excuse me. So individuals and interactions over processes and tools. That means that we value, face-to-face interactions, conversations, collaborative methods over just strictly following a process and ignoring all of that engagement on the side. We favor, people getting together in the same room and voting on things rather than using, a survey online or some kind of technical thing to do the work for us. So we favor that people piece in Agile. Working software over documentation. So that means that, we value a working product, something that actually works. We want to get that in front of the customer. And that's valued way more than, creating this long 8-month plan worth of documentation, compliance requirements, and all these rules and regulations that really don't matter if at the end of the day, the product doesn't work or the product doesn't add value to the customer's life or experience. So that's what working software over documentation means. And you might see comprehensive documentation. Either of those means the same thing. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So again, we value the customer's input. We want to collaborate with them, see what works best for them, what works best for us, and kind of meet in the middle to make sure everyone is happy. We value that over, a stringent, strict, black and white contract that we have to abide by. So it kind of goes back to that processes and tools piece. We want to involve the customer and make it a little flexible because we know customer needs change. We know their desires change, the market changes, technology changes. So we want to keep up this open, kind of flowing conversation with the customers over this rigid contract or processes. And then last but not least, responding to a change over following a plan. So they kind of all follow the same kind of agile mindset of, expecting change because customer needs change. And we want that because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're delivering a product that works. And who's going to tell us if this product works best? The customer. So we involve them. And then Agile, you'll see, it's not that it doesn't follow a plan or that there's no planning involved. It just means that we are not going to, spend 8 months or 9 months on the front end to come up with this big elaborate plan when we know that things will change. So we like to, expect change and allow some flexibility to allow us to respond to change as opposed to sticking to a hardcore plan. And you'll notice on the right side, all of these kind of follow the more traditional, predictive, kind of formal style of project management. And Agile, like I said at the beginning, is almost the complete opposite of predictive. So let's move on to Agile characteristics. Now, these are also good to know just in case you see these phrases on the exam, you'll know, or you'll at least get a hint that you're in an Agile environment or a hybrid environment. One thing that's going to help you on the test is knowing what kind of project management environment you're in. So knowing if you're in a predictive environment, which requires a lot of formality, a lot of formal change processes, a lot of heavy processes that you may not see in Agile, or if you're in an Agile environment where change is welcome, things are flexible, et cetera, et cetera. My rule of thumb is if the question does not tell you that you're in an Agile environment, if you don't see any of these phrases or characteristics in the question, then assume that you're in a predictive environment. Assume that the formalities are there. Assume that the change requests, have to be approved and go through this formal process. Don't ever assume that you're in an agile environment, and unless the question, implies that or hints at that. So servant leadership is definitely one that you'll see associated with Agile and Scrum quite a bit. Servant leadership just means, as a project manager or a Scrum master or a project lead, either of those terms works. You're there to serve the team. You're there to make sure that they have what they need to succeed. You're there to make sure they have, no distractions, no impediments, nothing in their way to get the project done. And you're there to facilitate these kind of meetings that happen throughout the life cycle of a project in Agile. So servant leadership, you're there to serve. This idea of self-organizing teams. So teams come together on their own, not because there's no management in Agile, but because the idea is the people doing the work know what's needed. So they'll know what experts to bring onto the project team. They'll know what skill sets are needed for the project team. So, we allow them to kind of self-organize, find the needs that they, need on the project, find the skill sets that they need, and then allow them to kind of carry on the project work. That's self-organizing teams. Transparency and collaboration. You will never choose an answer on the exam that, prevents stakeholders from getting information, withholds information from stakeholders or executives or your project team. That is just not an Agile principle. Neither does it align with the PMI mindset. So that's a rule of thumb across the board. But it's especially in the case for Agile. They have these artifacts called information radiators. So things like the Kanban board that, like we were talking about at the beginning, things like burn down charts, these kind of big visible, charts and graphs and just, reports of where we are on a project. And the idea is that you can put one of these physical things in a room. A stakeholder can walk into the room, kind of see quickly where people are, and then walk out, no questions asked. That's the idea of transparency and radiating information across stakeholders. The collaboration, it's a core principle of Agile. People work together. Silos are not a thing. It's all about, it's not about the project manager making decisions for the team. It's about them coming together collaboratively to make the best decision for the project. Short feedback cycles. So we like to do work no longer than 4 weeks at a time, as short as 2 weeks at a time. Those are called sprints. Usually the norm is 2 weeks. So, short periods of work. At the end of each sprint, there are things called, sprint reviews, which we'll talk about here in a second, sprint retrospectives. These are all opportunities to collect feedback from either the customer or the team itself. And this is, again, a core principle of Agile because we want to know how we're doing so that we can adjust accordingly. We don't want to stick to a plan. We don't want to stick to a contract. We want to be the best version of ourselves so that we can deliver the best deliverable across the board. That's short feedback cycles. Time boxed work just means that whatever work that we're doing has a time limit around it. Many meetings in Agile are time boxed, meaning that they shouldn't go past a certain amount. And we'll talk about some of those here in a second. A sprint itself is time boxed. Again, it should never be less than 2 weeks, never be more than 4 weeks. That's a time box. Frequent and early value delivery. We did talk about this just a few minutes ago, but this just means we want to get something in front of the customer as quickly as possible that adds some value, that adds some functionality, that adds to their experience. And we want to do that as often as possible on Agile projects. Hence the short feedback cycles and, customer collaboration piece. And then last but not least, change is welcomed, change is normal, change is expected. Change is just not a big deal in Agile. It's a part of the framework itself, and it's managed through one of the backlogs, which we'll talk about here in a second. Welcome to the few people that have joined. Thank you so much for hopping on the call. We're just going over Agile and Scrum here shortly. If you have any questions, just drop it in the chat, or you can unmute and interrupt me. I'm totally fine either way. All right, what is Scrum? So this is kind of a confusing one for a lot of people. Agile and Scrum technically are not the same thing. Agile is the bigger umbrella mindset that sets the framework for, change is welcome, customer collaboration, etc. Scrum is a methodology. It outlines the steps for how we're going to complete the work. And it's one of many different methods of Agile. You may have heard of extreme programming or XP, test-driven development, feature-driven development, Crystal. There's all types of Agile methodologies out there. Scrum is just one of many, but it is the most popular, which is why it's often paired with Agile. Again, Scrum defines how we're going to get the work done, and it defines who's going to do what on the team. And we'll talk about roles here in a second, but there are very specific tasks that are tied to different roles on a Scrum team. And that's kind of where you hear the terms product owner, Scrum master, developers. Those all come from the Scrum methodology. And so another way to think about it is Scrum is, most methods of Scrum are Agile, but not all Agile is Scrum. So that's kind of how you can think about it. And I say most versions of Scrum because it kind of gets weird the deeper you get into Agile. Sometimes people combine Scrum with predictive, so technically that's not Agile, but most versions of Scrum, Kanban, Lean, those are all different types of Agile, but not all Agile methods are Scrum. So what makes Scrum so different? Mostly the roles and the ceremonies or the meetings that you probably have heard of if you've been studying for the PMP. Product owner is one of the main ones on the Scrum team. The product owner owns the vision. They own kind of the big idea, the big final deliverable that we're looking to release on this project. They own that piece. What's important to know for the exam is that they own the product backlog. The product backlog is just a big, backlog or to-do list, if you will, of all the things that we need to complete to achieve this final product or this final deliverable. The product owner owns the backlog and they prioritize it accordingly. So it could be a backlog of 100 items. The product owner is the one responsible for prioritizing those items as often as possible, depending on what the need is for the customer at that time, or what the urgency is at that time. It could be that we discovered a risk on the project and now we have to focus on that instead of actually building something for the software. So now the risk items have been prioritized over actually building the software piece. But all those decisions belong to the product owner. They're also called the voice of the customer. This is not on this document, but the reason they're called the voice of the customer is because the product owner is the one talking to the customer and then communicating those needs to the project team. So they're kind of the liaison between the customer and the team. Something else to know for the exam, the product owner should never be the one to assign tasks to project team members, nor do they have the authority, according to PMI, to add new items or new work in the middle of a sprint. So once a sprint starts, there should never be any work added to it. And that's probably a question that you'll end up getting on the exam at some point, or at least on a practice exam. Scrum Master. So this is probably the most equivalent of a project manager on a Scrum team, but they don't actually do any of the executing or the project work. They do more of the facilitating. They do more coaching, more mentoring. They lead all of the meetings like the daily stand-up, the sprint reviews, the team retrospectives. They are responsible for kind of helping the team to remove any blockers or impediments that might be, slowing down the team from achieving their objectives. That is their main role. And on the exam, we know these things are not, realistic in real life all the time. But for the exam, know that the Scrum Master should never perform project work. They should never, just do a task because we're running out of time or because the project team is behind. This should never be the case where they take on their own, tasks from the backlog. Nor should they ever prioritize the backlog. So you might get a question about, a new customer need has come up. It's very, very urgent. The product owner is nowhere to be found. They went on vacation or something. Should the Scrum Master take it upon themselves to prioritize the backlog? The answer is no. It's never going to be the case where PMI allows the Scrum Master to prioritize the backlog. Development team. So if you see the word developers, just think your project team. Remember, Agile is a very software-based framework, so developers, project team, same thing. But these are the people that are responsible for doing the actual work, the sprint work. They're also estimating how much effort each backlog item is going to take, how complex it is. They're going to decide the approach that they take to complete the work. That is going to be your development team. The one thing you want to know about them for the exam is they should never allow new work to be added to the sprint, and they have the authority to kind of push back when that does happen. Those are your Scrum roles, just 3 different roles. Agile planning hierarchy. So I'll go over this at a very high level. You don't need to do a deep dive into any of these, but you should be able to distinguish between all of them. So your product vision is just your large overarching goal. This is your big dream, what you imagine this project to look like, function like at the end of the project. A roadmap is just a map of milestones. So it's your major markers of progress along your road trip. Just think about it like that. So your vision is your, the road trip that you want to take, let's say from Texas to California. Your product roadmap are all the major pit stops that you're going to make across the way. All the major, I'm going to stop in Dallas and spend the night. I'm going to stop in New Mexico and spend the night. I'm going to stop in Vegas and spend the night. Those are your milestones. That's your product roadmap. Your release plan, so you take one of those milestones and you plan all the activities that need to be completed in order to meet that milestone. So it's a more granular level of your roadmap. Your sprint planning, so this is when the team gets together and says, okay, here's our release plan. Here's all the items that we need to complete in order to make up this release or make up this milestone. What can we commit to for the next 2 weeks? And then they go through each item and kind of measure, how long is it going to take? How much effort is it going to require? How complex is this task? Do we need to break it down into smaller tasks? All of that happens in the sprint planning meeting. Again, know the difference between these 4, know that they exist. You won't have to do any major deep dive on any of them, but at least know the terminology and be familiar with them for the exam. Scrum ceremonies, so you definitely want to be familiar with these and be familiar with kind of the guidelines that are set for each one. And I'll try to go through these quickly. So your daily stand-up meeting, it happens every day, same place, same time, ideally. The idea is for everyone to stand up in a circle. And the idea behind that is that if everyone is standing, it gives people a little bit more urgency when they're talking so that the meeting can be short and sweet like it's intended to be. It should never be more than 15 minutes. So if you get a question about the daily stand-ups are lasting longer because stakeholders have questions and they're having side conversations, the answer should never be to extend the stand-up. The answer will always lean more towards, politely coach the stakeholders on having those conversations offline or in the meeting at 15 minutes and talk to the stakeholders, outside of the meeting. It'll never be to extend the time period. And that's just a general rule for Agile. You never want to extend the sprint, extend the stand-up, extend the review. It's just not an Agile principle. The daily stand-up should be the Scrum team and the project team. Stakeholders can observe, they can be there and be present, but they shouldn't be asking questions or distracting the team from answering these next 3 questions that are required for every daily stand-up. So for every daily stand-up, the Scrum Master will ask, what did you do today? What do you plan to do today? And what is blocking you? And again, stakeholders can be present for this, but if they have follow-up questions, ideally we want them to be, those conversations to be had after the daily stand-up. These are the 3 questions that you do want to know for the exam. What's blocking you? This is, what's slowing you down? What's in your way? What challenges do you have that might prevent you from getting those things done today? And it's the Scrum Master's role to take those things and, pretty much get them resolved for the team. The sprint itself, you guys are probably familiar with this term. It's a short time box period of work. This is where the work gets done, where the project team or the developers, start to code, they start to develop, they start to build software. and it should never be more than 4 weeks, and it should always be at least 2 weeks. And you might get a question about stakeholders are frustrated because they're not seeing enough updates. They're only getting to see the product every other month or, every 6 weeks. The answer is going to be to bring that sprint down, back down to 4 weeks or 2 weeks or something shorter that fits within the parameters. So 2 to 4 weeks. Sprint planning, let me scoot this up a little bit. We just talked about this, so I won't go over it again, but just know this part is owned by the team, and this is where they estimate and decide how complex each backlog item is. So those are your ceremonies. Let's go over a few more. Sprint review is one that you'll need to know for sure. This is where the team presents whatever they've been working on for the past 2 weeks. They present this to customers, to the product owner, and to stakeholders. They're there not to get approval necessarily, but to get feedback on, again, what's working, what's not working, so that the team can take that, plan for the next sprint, and then, fix it or pivot accordingly. The reviews are facilitated by the Scrum Master, and they take place towards the end of the sprint. And at the very end is a sprint retrospective or team retrospective. This is a meeting where the project team itself, so no stakeholders, no kind of outsiders there. This is for the team to reflect on each other's performance. So they share feedback about what processes they think went well, which processes they should change, where we need improvement as a team. That's what kind of comes up in retrospectives. And these take place at the very end of the sprint. They're usually about 2 to 4 hours, so they're pretty long. But this is it's not it's a mandatory ceremony for Scrum. So this needs to happen. It's another feedback loop, and again, it allows the team to get better and develop as the project progresses. All right, so we've gone over roles, ceremonies, the planning. There's some other pieces in here that I do want you guys to be familiar with. Let's go over artifacts. And again, these are probably terms that you've heard of, but I just want to add some clarification and highlight what you need to know for the exam specifically. So the product backlog, again, just a full backlog or list of items that need to be done on a project. What you should know is that changes in Agile are managed through the product backlog. That means if we present a project, let's say we present this Yeti to the customer, they say, this is nice, but we really wanted a more circular handle. We add that to the product backlog. We don't do any formal processes. We just add that new requirement of circular handles to the product backlog. Doesn't mean that it'll be prioritized right away. Doesn't mean that it'll be done on the next sprint, but it means that it's been added to the backlog, and now the product owner can come in and prioritize it against the other items as needed. So the backlog itself represents the scope in Agile. A user story, it's just a requirement or another item in the backlog that is written from the customer's experience. It usually takes the form of, as a blank, I want blank, so that blank. And you do want to know this kind of, fill in the blank sentence for user stories for the exam. As a banking customer, I want to be able to drive through so that I can get my money without getting out of my car. That's a user story. And so the idea is not to focus on the solution, meaning, customer needs a drive-through ATM. The story is, I want to be able to drive through, get my cash without getting out of my car. So there's kind of more context to the requirement. That's the idea of a user story. Back in the day when things were more, written on paper and we didn't have so much technology, user stories were literally written on a small card. And the idea is that it should be short enough and simple enough to fit on a card. You do want to remember the 3 C's for a user story: card, conversation, confirmation, meaning it should be small enough to be written on a card. You should have a conversation with the person who submitted the user story about it, and then get a confirmation on the final version of this story or the final version of the requirement. So remember the 3 C's. I know it's kind of an ambiguous concept to remember. Remember this kind of fill in the blank statement for the exam, and then know the INVEST criteria. I think it's Bill Wake's INVEST criteria. You may have seen it come up in your studies, but know what this means. User stories should be independent, meaning they're not, attached to other user stories. They can be done without another user story having to be done first. They should be negotiable. So again, nothing is set in stone in Agile. Everything is a conversation and an agreement. They should add value. So the V stands for valuable. They should be estimatable. So we should be able to estimate how much effort this user story will require, how complex it'll be. It should be small. So again, small enough to fit on a card, and then testable. How can we test this against, itself to make sure that we did the right thing? So know the invest criteria as well for user stories. Any questions on user stories or anything that we've gone over so far? All right, and welcome to my new folks in the room. Sprint backlog. This is just the backlog of items that will be completed in the upcoming sprint. What you need to know about this is that once it is set in stone, once the sprint starts, this should not be changed by anyone, even the product owner, even the product sponsor, who is the person paying for the project. An increment, just a small piece of value or functionality that we deliver to a customer. Increments are added on to a larger product to make up the final version. You definitely need to know MVP, a minimum viable product. It's kind of the simplest form or simplest version of a product that we can deliver to a customer with the purposes of getting feedback. So again, we can take my Tumblr example. We can use this as our MVP to eventually get enough feedback to get us to this. MVPs are very important in Agile because again, it's all about customer feedback. It's all about not getting too deep into the weeds without getting some feedback and knowing that we're going in the right direction. That's the idea of an MVP. And then an MBI. So again, we're adding functionality in increments. Each of those increments is an MBI. It's a minimum business increment. It's just a small piece of functionality that can be added to a larger product. Definition of done. So this is just kind of it's very similar to acceptance criteria that we hear on the traditional side of things. It's just a set of criteria or items that need to be checked off in order for everyone to consider this deliverable or this item done. So it could be some documentation that's required. It could be a certain functionality that people are looking for. Whatever it is, whatever the parameters are, it should be added to the definition of done so that everyone can agree this is actually a completed item and it can be used for the next phase in the project. Questions about the artifacts here? Okay. These I won't go into detail here, but I do suggest that you get familiar with these kind of games or techniques in Agile. T-shirt sizing, Fibonacci scale, doubles. These are just ways to measure a user story or a backlog item. For example, if something is measured in large, that means it requires a whole lot of effort compared to something that's measured as small, which has less effort. Fibonacci scale. So if you read this scale, there's usually a 1 in front of it, but it's a relative scale. So it adds the number in front of it and just gets bigger over time. So 1, 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8, 8 plus 5 equals 13. That's the Fibonacci scale. No, at least T-shirt sizing and Fibonacci scale for the exam. Doubles, kind of an obvious sequence there, but just another way to estimate user stories. Know these prioritization techniques like Moscow, like Kano, 100 points method, paired comparison. If you're not familiar with either of these techniques, a simple Google will fill in the gap for you. But just create a flashcard for them and know kind of how they're used and when they're used. Same for consensus techniques, fist of 5, Roman voting, dot voting. You are more than likely to get a question on at least one of these techniques. These are just different ways to get a votes or get a consensus when you have a lot of people in the room with differing opinions. And so you want to make sure that you're familiar, not necessarily with how to execute each one of these, but be familiar with the name and what it's used for so that you don't confuse one of these for maybe an estimating technique. And then here, just kind of a run through, always choose answers that empower the team, encourage collaboration, welcome change, invite the stakeholder in, shares information, respects the roles. So again, product owner is not assigning tasks, Scrum Master is not taking on work, et cetera, et cetera. Continuous improvement. These are great kind of phrases or words to look out for when you're in an agile environment. That'll let you know you're on the right track when you're selecting your answer. And then avoid these. Again, never, as a Scrum Master or project manager, never make decisions for the team, never add work to a sprint, never force the Scrum Master to perform work, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to stop there and go back to our PowerPoint. Any questions on Agile before we move on to the new exam? Hopefully that wasn't too much information, but if you have a good handle on those roles and terminology in different ceremonies, you'll be fine for the exam. Agile tends to be much easier to grasp. All right, for those of you who might be taking the exam in July or considering, kind of thinking about which one you should take, let's quickly review what has changed on the exam. We will do, I'm going to break this up a little bit. But on the exam, so right now they're still doing pilot tests and they're testing, how different things will appear, what questions will be used on the exam, et cetera, et cetera. And so you might get, they're also teetering with the idea of adding an extra 10 minutes on the exam. It hasn't been decided in stone, but that may or may not be a big deal to you, but they are actually considering making the exam longer. So you have a little bit of extra time to get through those questions. The number of questions itself has not changed. It's still 180 questions. So if you are studying and you haven't started to practice your exam muscle, start to take longer and longer practice exams so that you can build your way up to 180 questions and you can kind of, learn how to manage your time accordingly on exam day. The eligibility period, so the experience that we have to prove that we have for the application. Before, we could only go back 8 years prior from the day that you're submitting the application. Now they're extending it to 10 years. So you can go as far back as 2016 if you need to for today. A much greater emphasis on business environment, a slightly lesser emphasis on process and people. Whereas before, people was about 42% of the exam. Now it's only about 33%, so just a third. Process, which is probably the hardest domain for the exam, it's gone down from 50% to 41%. But I do want you to still, know this has the most weight. So if you get anything below target in this area, it's likely that you won't be able to pass the exam. And this is usually the area where people struggle with the most on the exam. Business environment has gone up quite a bit. It was only about 8% on the previous exam. Now it's 26%. So there's a bit of a conversation going around about PMI in the exam. They're kind of, they're noticing the introduction of AI and they're noticing how AI is kind of taking over some of the execution part of projects. They're automating things for us. We don't have to do things so manually anymore. And so PMI has now focused on the things that AI can't really, kind of control or take over, which is business environment, right? Measuring value, deciding whether or not a project is feasible, deciding how a product can be sustained over a long period of time after a project ends. So you'll hear words like sustainability quite a bit more on the exam. AI, as you probably heard, is an official part of the exam. So you will see some questions about AI, mostly generative AI. So, things like Copilot and ChatGPT, and just how AI can be used to automate tasks, and then how those solutions can be sustained. Again, making sure that they're not infecting the environment, making sure that they're not, having a negative impact on the political world or the environment itself. That's more so what sustainability is. A lot more emphasis on tailoring. So tailoring is just the idea of, picking certain processes that fit to your project. The idea that you don't have to use all 49 processes that PMBOK recommends. You can pick and choose and adapt the processes as you need to for your particular project. There's a lot more emphasis on that in the new exam. The process grid itself has changed quite a bit. So the amount of processes has gone down from 49 to about 40, I believe. So let's take a look at these on the next slide. You'll see here, the grid itself looks a little bit different, and there's a couple of reasons why. For one, the process groups are now called focus areas. So initiating, planning, executing, monitor, control, closing, those are no longer process groups. Those are focus areas. And I believe the idea, if I had to take a guess here, was that people often confuse those for phases. So they just changed the name altogether. There are 3 less knowledge areas. So you can see that integration has left the building there. We no longer have cost. We no longer have communications. We don't have quality. We don't have procurement. We have a new set of knowledge areas or performance domains. We only have about 7 now. Governance has kind of taken the place of integration. It's just, how we make decisions on a project, who approves what, making sure that things are considered from a high level. So it's still kind of the same idea, just a different name. Scope is the same, schedule's the same. Cost has been kind of converted to finance. Often, again, if I had to guess, because people often just considered, the upfront costs and not the long-term financial piece, the interest rates and what will this cost us after the project ends, and all of the earned value, the cost performance index and schedule performance index. All of that has kind of been rebranded to finance. Communications and stakeholder engagement has been combined into just stakeholders now. And then we have resources and risk. So again, fewer processes, a lot less performance domains, a little bit of, I guess, conciseness was added to the process grid, which is kind of nice. And then outside of that, no other major changes on the processes themselves. You'll see that often most of the names are the same here. It's just the way they've been grouped together and combined are a little bit laid out differently on this new exam. So don't freak out if you are taking the exam in July. Most of the material that you're covering today will apply. You'll just see a little bit of addition on sustainability. You'll get some clarity on what AI questions you'll get on the exam. And then you'll want to memorize the new process grid and some of the new outputs that have been associated with them. If there are no further questions, I know we have just a minute or 2 left. I just want to thank you for your time. If you have learned anything, if these webinars have been valuable to you, I know a few of you have been attending my webinars for the last few months, so I thank you so much. Please leave a Google review. You're very welcome. And then also, if you need some study guides or you're interested in coaching, please, my website is open to you all. Make an appointment, make a free consultation appointment. We can talk about your journey and get you what you need to pass before the exam changes in July.